All right, welcome everyone. Welcome back to the Black Carnivore podcast. I am really excited to bring today's guest, Nina Teicholz, who is the author of The Big Fat Surprise and also the founder of the Nutrition Coalition, which is an advocate for science-based nutrition. And I'm just really excited about today's conversation because I think that, there were two books that really kind of turned my mind around initially around a low carb diet and the importance of removing carbohydrates from your diet. And that was, I think, Gary Taubes's first book, Good Calories, Bad Calories. And then this one, The Big Fat Surprise. There was, and I've talked about it before in this channel, so I hope you all have had a chance to read it in preparation for today. But there was a lot of really stunning information that, really made me question the nutrition information that is put out there, science, whether we can trust scientific studies, what they're actually saying. And I think it's really important to ask those questions always. We can't become complacent and just trust what we're being told. So anyway, I want to dive right in and allow Nina to talk about, the book and herself and all of the things. Let's just go ahead and get started.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on your show. I've watched your show and have really enjoyed it, and I'm delighted to be here. So you tell me what we should talk about first, or I can just start randomly talking about my book or whatever you like.
Well, why don't we talk about the book for a little bit, but then, we definitely want to dive into like what is happening now. Because the book was published when? In like 2011 or 13? Oh, 14.
Yeah,
okay.
2014.
Okay.
So, yeah, I mean, that book is, it was the first book really to take on the question. A central theme was, do saturated fats cause heart disease? So taking on the question about saturated fats, because I think others had sort of taken on the larger question, like, does fat make us fat? Fat generally, like, does fat make us fat? But this was the first attempt really to kind of get at the questions about good fats versus bad fats, right? We've always been told, avoid saturated fats and instead replace them with polyunsaturated vegetable oils, replace butter with margarine. And that's still what we're told today. And I got into this field because I'm a journalist and I had been assigned to do a story on trans fats for a magazine way back in the early 2000s. And this sort of plunged me into this whole world of science that really, is so fascinating. I know so many people who've gotten dragged down the same rabbit hole that I did, but which is, just so interesting, all the early studies. So I read, maybe 10,000 studies on going back to some of the very earliest studies in nutrition. But I also spoke to hundreds and hundreds of scientists. And one of the things that fascinated me was how afraid they were to talk about this subject. Like I literally had people hanging the phone up on me. Or I would have people say, listen, if you're taking the line of Gary Taubes on fat, I can't even talk to you. And people would tell me stories about being heckled in conferences when they were trying to talk about trans fats. Turned out those hecklers were industry lackeys who'd been hired by the Vegetable Oil Association specifically to heckle people at conferences and make it difficult for them to present their results. So I just knew there was this huge story there that was far beyond trans fats. And that's what led me to this book, which took almost a decade to research and write, and also had 2 children while I was doing that. But it really is, it remains an incredibly fascinating subject because, there are 2 main reasons. I think one of them is that it's such an unbelievable story that we could have been told something so fundamentally wrong. Like there's this really a huge lie out there about what is a healthy healthy diet, and how long that has lasted and why it's lasted so long. But it's such a huge untruth that really remains until this day. So that is completely fascinating. And then I'm also, continue to be fascinated and interested and motivated to stay in the field because there are so many people suffering. I mean, to hit on a subject where you find out that as the emails come, I'm sure you get them too, that come to you about people really are suffering with their health. And here you have information that can help them. So there's almost an obligation really to try to get that information out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You feel too.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes it feels, overwhelming and kind of like an impossible feat.
Right.
I feel like your book like really hit on, the heart of the argument. So like you must have had the worst arguments, the worst, had people really get on you about what you were writing. What kind of pushback did you experience?
Well, before my book even came out, there was an article in the Huffington Post by a Yale, not a professor, just somebody who was connected to Yale, and because I had a cover story in the Wall Street Journal opinion pages, and he reacted to that. And he had a series of articles about me, about how I was a parasite of science, and I mean, he just could not stop insulting me. And it turns out, he runs a vegetarian advocacy group. And I think the thing about my book is that it was the first, Gary Taubes had written a lot before me, but mine really got much more attention than his books for whatever reason. I got all these, Book of the Year awards and named by various different journals and The Economist and the Wall Street Journal. It got so much attention. And so that meant that I was more dangerous. And I had, hit pieces written on me by various groups. And it's still happening because I'm still writing and publishing and doing things that are dangerous to people who are invested in this other paradigm. Let's say that's the paradigm of a the whole food plant-based diet, right? That's supposed to be the most healthy diet. And there's so much invested in that by pharmaceutical companies, by big food, by people there's so much industry that is developed around this whole food plant-based diet. And then there are people in universities who really just can't bear that something might be right other than what they have devoted their careers to, which I think is completely understandable. There's a lot of cognitive dissonance. I lived with a lot of cognitive dissonance for years. Like, how can this be right? How can I be right? How can that be wrong? How is it that everything we've believed in can be wrong? It's very difficult to really shift your mind around and start to believe something which is so different from what we've all lived with for pretty much our whole lives. We lived with this phobia of fat and all these other ideas. And so to change that is really, really difficult. This is a carnivore group. So I'll say, like, for me, I had not eaten red meat for over 25 years. And then due to my research, I realized that meat was what humans always most craved. That was the food that they most desired, that when they were poor, they wanted nothing but meat, that they were, this was the food that was the most, and it represented wealth, it represented strength. And so it was impossible for me to read all of this and then not think, well, I should eat meat too. That should be in my diet. So that was just part of that transformation for me, actually buying a piece of raw red meat and putting it on my countertop in my kitchen and thinking like, well, okay, how am I going to cook this? I haven't cooked a piece of meat, decades, or ever really. And so that was just sort of part of what is, I think, this transformation. But what I'm saying is, I think there's a great sort of cognitive shift that has to go on for people to change the way they think. And then for some people, it's really easy. Some people, I get emails from people that said, I read your book. Makes total sense. That's what my grandparents did, and now I completely changed my diet and lost 100 pounds, and I'm great. And there are other people
Yeah.
who just like it takes them a little longer than that. They have some
Yeah.
questions.
Well, I feel like the people who have not been like working on their health or paying attention to health stuff, like for them, it is easier because they're like, oh yeah, my grandparents did that. All right, I'm done. That's what I'm doing. But,
Right.
you know, for everyone else who's been invested in like learning Weight Watchers or learning this or learning that diet, like, you know, there's been so much more indoctrination going on that there's a lot to unpack there.
Right. A lot of
So,
commitment, and for women especially, for women who spend so much time thinking about these issues and feeling their lives are controlled by them, and it's much harder, I think, for women to really change those ideas.
mhm.
In my, it
Well,
is just an observation that I have.
no, I totally agree. I mean, you know, women are supposed to be the ones handling, you know, the food and the family. And so, you know, that's what we do actually impacts everybody a lot more than, you know, what men might do, I think, with around food. So, yeah, so it is important to especially, you know, kind of deal with what's going on with women. Um, so but I was going to ask, you know, I think that what was so interesting about your book is that you know, you did all of this investigation on like what happened with the science, you know, where exactly did things go wrong and information be doctored you know, just suppressed or faked. And that was like a piece that I think most people had never, you know, seen or heard before. So can you tell
Mhm.
us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that's interesting. When I was researching, I felt a little bit like I was on this treasure hunt, looking at papers. You know, you take a scientific paper. Most doctors, when they read papers, they just read, or even academics, they just read the, you know, the summary, and then they kind of just get to the conclusion. And what I realized that was that in this particular field of nutrition, scientists had been basically misrepresenting their results, lying mainly to themselves, because I believe, you know, the papers that came out in the 60s and 70s, which is when was sort of the formation of this field, all the ideas started to form about that fat is bad, you have to stop, we have a low fat diet, and that we should switch from saturated fats to unsaturated fats. All of that happened in the 1960s and 70s. And what one discovers in researching it is that here, you know, here's the headline from the paper, and if you go and you read the paper, the you know, the data just doesn't support what they're saying. I mean, there's one fascinating paper. There's many fascinating stories. There's a story actually of the Framingham study, which is the largest and longest study that followed people over decades. It was an NIH, National Institutes of Health funded study. And there was one guy who was studying diet, looking at at diet and people's diets. And they were meticulous about how they collected the diet, and they weighed and they measured everything and they double checked everything. It was like an unusual level of detail and rigor that they subjected themselves to. At the end, they published this volume of the Framingham report, which said they could find no effect of saturated fat on heart cardiovascular outcomes. No effect. They said it must be something else that's causing heart disease. And that paper, of I don't know how many volumes, but maybe let's say there's 70 volumes of the Framingham report, and this one is number 21 or 23, not published. The only one that's not published. And that,
But people talk about the Framingham study all the time. Like
right, don't
until
know
you
about
just said this, I've never known that this existed.
there is this report, and I've posted it, and I can get you a link online, but it's by the dietitian, Tavia Gordon, and also it was one of the overseer was George Mann, who was the professor from Vanderbilt who went off and studied the Messiah warriors later, because he had come up with this finding and wondered, well, maybe saturated fat isn't so bad after all. But that was an unpublished study that even to this day, recently I was talking to somebody who is on the Framingham study, which continues. They've had Framingham 1, Framingham 2, he's on the Framingham study, and he did not know about this paper.
Wow.
That is unpublished.
So how did you get it if it's unpublished?
So it was given by Tavia Gordon I think it was to Gary Taubes, but it may have been somebody before him. I got it from Gary Taubes, but there may have been somebody before him who got their hands on that paper. It may have been this past president of the Journal of the American Medical Association who wrote one of these, actually was sort of pre-Gary Taubes, wrote something like Good Calories, Bad Calories, but it was never really published. Anyway.
So is there a possibility that someone will say, that's not a real paper? Like, I don't know where that came from. Like,
no, it's clearly an NIH publication. I mean, it's clearly,
okay.
It's clearly, and there were the protocols for this that were published. There are 2 papers of the protocols that were published, and then the final publication is clearly by the same people. So, but there's another story that I think is maybe a little bit more well known, which is that the Minnesota Coronary Survey, another NIH study, that was the largest ever study looking at saturated fats bad for health. It took place in 5 mental institutions in Minnesota, which you can't do now because it's not considered ethical, but they controlled everybody's food. So it turned out to be a pretty highly controlled experiment. People are not wandering in and out. They are not at home with a diet book, and you're not, as an investigator, just guessing or wondering whether or not they're actually following the diet. I mean, you're feeding these people their food. And it included men and women, over 9,000 of them, and followed them for 4.5 or 5 years. And at the end of that, they could find no difference between the people who were eating the regular hamburgers, regular cheese, regular milk, and the people who were eating whatever the Impossible Burger was back in that time, and soy-filled cheese and soy-filled milk. No difference in outcomes. And that paper was not published for 17 years.
How is that possible?
Which is not, that's not doing science by the rules, right? You're supposed to publish your findings even if they're disappointing to you. And in fact, when one of the lead researchers, Ivan France, was asked, why didn't you publish this paper? And when they did publish it, they put it in this very out of the way journal that I'm sure nobody's ever heard, no nutrition scientist read it, called ATVB. Ivan France said, well, there was nothing wrong with the study. We were just so disappointed in the way it came out. Meaning they were so
how would they say something like that? I mean, they're scientists. They know that that's like not right.
I think at that point in and this happened over in not that specific, but incidents like this, where another Jeremiah Stamler, who was a close friend of Ansel Keys. I don't know. People know the Ansel Keys story, but he was in Chicago, and he was a doctor, a cardiologist. He did something called the Western Electric study, where he looked at people who worked in the Western Electric lines looked at their diet and to see, if their diet correlated with their cardiovascular outcomes. And he could find no correlation between a diet high in meat and cheese and fat and whatever with poor cardiovascular outcomes. And he did something which I found in maybe, 20, 30, 40 other papers, which is, we could not find this outcome. But since we know that since we know that saturated fat is bad for health, and there must be something wrong with our study. And let's quote somebody else's conclusions rather than our own conclusions. And this just happened over and over again in papers. The conclusions were, we didn't find, unfortunately, we were not able to find it, but we know it's true because other people have found it. And because the field was so rigid at that point, you understand, like this hypothesis called the diet heart hypothesis, that saturated fat and cholesterol cause heart disease, right? So this hypothesis had been adopted by the American Heart Association, by the National Institutes of Health, it was like a clean sweep. So if you're in the field and you're not finding something that supports the diet heart hypothesis, it ruins your career. And in fact, I did talk to scientists whose careers were ruined because they came out with results and they were unafraid to talk about them that were contrary to the diet heart hypothesis. I mean, if this doesn't make you think a little bit about, some of the things we're experiencing today in terms of group mind think around some of the issues we're dealing with.
Yeah.
I mean, this idea it's very powerful. And in the case of science, you have this situation where if you're too confrontational, you're not going to get your grant approved by the National Institutes of Health. Then you have no money. If you have no money, you can't do an experiment. Then you can't be a scientist, and you won't get invited to conferences, and you won't be, you just won't be part of the club, and you won't be able to do your work. So there was a tremendous amount of there really was. It was very threatening to people, and I think the scientific community quickly learned that if you did stick your head up, I mean, as say George Mann did, the one who was the Framingham study, and others, they would get, they got punished. In fact, George Mann told me that he was in an NIH hallway talking to a secretary who sort of took him aside and said, listen, if you continue your opposition to Ansel Keys, you're going to lose your research funding. Ansel Keys, of course, being the most famous proponent of this diet-heart hypothesis and a very powerful man. And sure enough, shortly after that, he lost his research funding. So this sends a message. I mean, we're seeing this in universities today, right? Where unfortunately, it sends, this kind of punishment sends a message to other scholars, other researchers, and says to them, if you stick your neck out, this is your punishment. And people learn they don't want to lose their jobs. So I think it's a little bit by way of explaining, or one of the things that explains is why it was the journalist community that was able to bring this information more to light, right? We don't rely on NIH research grants. We don't care about those conferences. Those are not our people. So, so we've had the liberty and freedom to write and talk about things that people inside the community cannot do.
Well, that's what journalists are supposed to do all around, right? You're supposed to be able, in every field, stick your nose in, ask questions, and shine light, and essentially be the the counterbalance to the regular rhetoric, right?
Yes, I think that theoretically that is true.
Theoretically, yes.
But I would say, especially for this community, I mean, in the area of red meat, that is just 100% not the case. I mean, there is no space to talk about the benefits of red meat that I have seen in the U.S. media. The media over in England is a little bit more free, and you can see a little bit of back and forth, but it is a shut down topic, I think, in the U.S. I really don't see. It's a tragedy and a disservice to the public, I think, not to talk about meat in any way that brings in anything about it being nutritionally dense or a good source of protein, or perhaps necessary for growing children and important for the vitamins and nutrients that women who want to get pregnant might need. I mean, all of that is being denied the public because there's this real lockdown on conversation about meat, mainly due to climate change. And there's been created, I think, by communications firms, PR firms, all those clever people who figure out how to manipulate our minds and make the majority of the public kind of have almost a revulsion to meat. It's like it makes them sick to think about it, and they judge you for eating it. So if you go to a dinner and order steak in certain parts of the country, people will really have kind of a visceral level of disgust about that choice and decision. And I think that is something that has been created. I don't think that just happened. I'm not a conspiracy theorist about it. I mean, I just have studied public relations and communications, and I see and read the newspapers obsessively, and I can see how it's happened.
Yeah, I did have someone write to me recently and said that she had tried to do keto and had struggled, and she had had the problems with keto crotch. And I was like, wow, wait a minute, that was like totally made up. There is no keto crotch. And so I was like, wow, I guess that it did kind of work. It seeped into the zeitgeist.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's a really fascinating example of how that story was planted out of nothing and
Yeah.
became kind of a a
So
phenomenon.
for those who are watching, I don't know if you remember, but like a couple of years ago, there was like one article that got published everywhere. It was like it was on the AP Wire. It got published in every newspaper around the world that basically said that keto causes keto crotch,
Which
which
was like some kind of unpleasant condition. It was like the worst. It was so offensive because it was like, oh, this it was offensive as an idea, and it was something you didn't really want to talk about. I think I tried to. I think it was that story where I actually tried to hunt down the origin of that story. Went back to the original source. I can't remember if it was this story or if it was another story where I ended up like it was clearly like it sounded like an auto repair shop in India, and I was like nobody spoke English and nobody was clearly not a news outlet. And
yeah.
but that's sort of the way they do it. They'll publish something like in some Indian publication, and then they drop it into the U.S. press, and then you have to realize that there's just dozens and dozens of websites that aren't real news. They just will publish stuff, and they're funded by who knows, this or that pharmaceutical company, and then but then those headlines are picked up by others as real headlines, and it sort of creates a storm. But that story ultimately appeared in Forbes or Forbes Online, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Anyway,
It
I
was
mean,
pretty surprising, but yeah,
what we're
go ahead.
talking about, in terms of meat, what we're talking about is something that's like, I think, far, far more serious and just a much, much bigger story about
Mm-hmm.
scapegoating meat as the one thing that it drives climate change, the one thing that we can do to contribute to stopping the warming of the earth, the one thing. I mean, it's just become. I mean, that is it involves actors like the World Economic Forum at Davos and pretty much every celebrity you've ever heard of. And I mean, it's just a much bigger beast that has created this impression about meat. We don't have to get
And
all into it. I'm just saying, like, it's interesting to
yeah.
me.
Well, I would love to shift into what you're doing now because you're continuing to work on that through the Nutrition Coalition, right? Um,
Yes.
but
Well, I mean, sorry, go
so
ahead.
just to say for everyone who has not read the Big Fat Surprise, it's a really densely packed and just full of information, so it's really hard to summarize. I hope that what we talked about now just titillated you and is you're picking up your Kindle right now to order it, so I highly recommend that.
Well,
But the science continues and the information continues, so let's hear about like what horrors are happening today, Nina.
yeah. Well, before we leave the book, I just want to let everybody know that other main areas that it contains are all about vegetable oils, how they came into the food supply, and what are the problems of vegetable oils, and especially when you heat them. And that is, I think, pretty interesting. And it contains this has always been my favorite, but a chapter on the Mediterranean diet, which is how it came into being that we have this thing called the Mediterranean diet that is so popular, and how that was basically funded by the European olive oil industry. It's a really amazing story. But what
Actually,
is
those two parts of the book are the ones I found most fascinating. And I kind of went to the book expecting to like learn more about why a low carb diet is so important. And I felt like I walked away understanding how damaging and dangerous vegetable oils are. And I didn't even know that, and I realized over time, as I would have little cheats in there, on my keto and later carnivore diet, that like a French fry was a way worse problem for me than a Jolly Rancher. Like the artificial, I mean, the vegetable oils was so much more inflammatory for my body. And, you know, and
Right.
so it was kind of reading that it was like, oh my God, I worked at McDonald's. I don't remember my uniform exploding, but I think that might have been before 93. But that idea, you know, was just stunning.
Yeah, I think the vegetable oils story, which I think pretty much started with my book, but I'm not sure. But I know that it's really exploded and become a central focus for many researchers and activists who want to focus on these oils, which are, I mean, I won't get into it too much, but ironically, when we got rid of trans fats were created through a process that actually stabilized these oils. And so when we got rid of trans fats, which was like a crusade in some ways, but I mean, it's not like I'm a fan of trans fats, but they did make these oils more stable. And without them, we are consuming, especially at restaurants. If you go out to eat, everybody, you know, every restaurant cooks with canola or soybean oil or something like that. Those are highly they oxidize very quickly under heated conditions, and then just create all kinds of degraded oxidation products, some of which are actually known toxins. So that piece of it, and the inflammatory part of it in omega-6 fatty acids, which are in vegetable oils, but also in and this is important to know, in nuts and peanut butter and, well, and I guess your community is not eating those foods, but one of the reasons that taking those out helps is that they are inflammatory. And maybe just one note that is relevant to your community, which is that pork has been bred to be higher in these omega-6 fatty acids, and so the ones that are easily oxidized are called linoleic and linolenic. And so that's why, like on a practical level, it's why like your bacon might go rancid in the fridge really quickly, because those
Wow. I didn't even know that could happen.
those fatty acids, they go bad really quickly. They go bad, you know, even when not heated, they go bad. So that's why, like, buying pastured pork, or recently I tweeted something about a provider who's specifically bred his pigs to be lower in linoleic and linolenic fatty acids, just to reduce those. That makes your pork fat more stable, less likely to oxidize. And again, it's a question of, yes, of course you don't want your pork going rancid quickly, but it's also just the effect. If you're somebody who is sensitive to oxidation, not everybody is, but if you are one of those people, where you feel it in your joints, or, you know, you just feel it in your body, that's an issue. It's something that most people don't think about. So just mentioning that here.
Wow, that's super helpful to hear that. And, you know, it's partly why I stopped eating like pork rinds and a lot of pork. I mean, now I eat a little bit more of it, fresh pork, but like I really had to stop because I noticed I had a lot of problems with it.
Interesting. I just bought a bag of pork rinds. I don't know what I'm thinking. Anyway, so where do things stand today? Well, you know, the Nutrition Coalition was a group that I started in 2015 because I read the 2015 dietary guidelines. You know, the dietary guidelines is the most influential nutrition policy that we have in the United States. And I'm just going to spend just a minute talking about them so you understand why they're so powerful. They dominate all federal nutrition programs. So that's determines, you know, your school lunches, school breakfasts, feeding programs for the elderly, women and infant children food baskets, the military, what the military eats, all the labels on food packaging. It is the reason that pork was bred to be more lean and have more omega-6 fatty acids. It's why all beef was bred to be lean. I mean, the dietary guidelines are enormously influential, and they're virtually downloaded by all doctors and dietitians and nutritionists and nurses to give to patients, so that people think they're getting their doctor's advice when in fact they're getting the dietary guidelines. Anyway, I had just come out with my book, and I read the 2015, the latest iteration. They come out every 5 years. 2015 was the latest one. And I read it, this like 450-page document, and I couldn't believe that there was no science. None of the science that I had studied, none of the science that I knew was in there. Like the fact that 49,000 women had been through a clinical trial called the Women's Health Initiative on the low-fat diet, and that the results were what we call null, like no benefit from, and this trial had gone on for 8 years. So no benefit in terms of cancer, diabetes, heart disease, or weight loss. So that wasn't in the dietary guidelines. And I thought, we need to get science in the dietary guidelines because they're so influential. And this was, of course, a very naive idea on my part, that somebody just needed to stand up there with the science and say, this, we can, you just must have overlooked it, or I don't know how this happened. But it turned out to be a really interesting educational experience for me, because I learned a lot about how policy is made and how hard it is to change it, especially something the size of the dietary guidelines, which controls, all these programs it controls amount to, like $800 billion a year. So that's a lot of money. So what we did do that was successful is we were able to get Congress to pay for and to mandate and pay for really the first ever outside peer review of the dietary guidelines by the National Academies of Sciences. So that was a big accomplishment. And then since then, we've been basically doing more of the same, like following up on that National Academy of Sciences report, trying to educate people about why there isn't science, what does it mean, what are the problems with the guidelines, where is science lacking. I think for this community, what is interesting is, it's probably most people don't care about the guidelines who have kind of taken their health into their own hands, right? But it still just it affects the doctors you see who think you're crazy or give you a hard time or not receptive to what you're doing. They're all very much impacted by these guidelines. It affects your elderly loved ones in nursing homes because they don't have choices about what they're eating. And in what's it served in hospitals and airplanes. So it does have an effect on our environment. And so this past guidelines, which came out in 2020, for the first time ever, they said we should be eating diets lower in red and processed meats. So they actually came out and said that. And they said this was reflected in the data, but they didn't do any, and they have never done any systematic review of the literature on red or processed meats. So they're just asserting that, and they didn't do any new review for this go around when they made this additional advice to reduce eating meat. They didn't review the literature to make that assertion. So, I hate to say that that's sort of typical of what goes on with the guidelines. They also said they reviewed the literature on dietary cholesterol, which is one of the reasons you're not supposed to eat meat, right? And they did a review on that. They came out and they said there's no evidence that dietary cholesterol has any impact on your blood cholesterol. And yet the dietary guidelines comes out and still says healthy diets are lower in cholesterol. This is
and lower in meat. Like if the cholesterol isn't the deal, then what are they saying is the problem with the meat and the processed meats?
So they don't really have an argument. What they're doing is they're relying, I should say, pretty much exclusively on observational studies. I don't know if your listeners, your watchers know about that, but these are the kinds of studies that show association and not causation. So they just follow people and they ask them what they eat, and the people send back a food frequency questionnaire where they say, I ate 10 apples a week and 5 of these and 4 pears. And the problem with those is that people lie about what they eat and they can't remember what they eat. So that's why that data is essentially weak. And ultimately, it can only show an association. It can't prove cause and effect. So it is known as a weak kind of data. And so what they're saying is that we've tested these dietary patterns that include, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, seeds, lower in red meat, processed meat, And we've determined from these observational studies, these people come out looking healthier at the end. Do we know that it's because of the red processed meat? Do we know because it's the more fruit and vegetables? Do we know if it's the nut or the seeds or the fish or whatever? They haven't, there's no way to know any of that. Or is it because these people who do eat more fruits and vegetables and whole grains also just tend to be what we know as the healthy adherer types of people who also they tend not to smoke. I mean, I'm sure you've talked about this in your podcast, but when you look at meat eaters, other than like select carnivore communities, meat eaters, they're the people with like, they've got the Philly dog in one hand and a beer in the other hand. They tend to be more obese and they drink more, they smoke more. They just tend to do everything that the doctor would tell them not to. And so they are sicker, they look sicker, but is it the meat or is it like all the other stuff they're doing? And this kind of observational study can't tease that out, right? Can't tell you. They try to make adjustments, but they can't really adjust for, what is an unhealthy lifestyle. So this is the poor quality of evidence on which our dietary guidelines are based. And as I said, they're not even fine having legitimate scientific results and then passing them along. They're just not even reviewing the science, or they're reviewing the science and then like they did with cholesterol and then saying the opposite. I'll give you one other example, which we analyzed in a lot of detail. And there's now a paper that's been published in Nutrients about this on saturated fat, right? So saturated fat was another reason that you were supposed to not eat red meat. It was actually the original reason you were not supposed to eat red meat. So, we went over there. Well, this paper goes over all the evidence on saturated fats and concludes that there's not evidence to support keeping these caps on saturated fats, right? So there's no reason that you should not eat as much meat as you like. Saturated fats should not be the rate limiting factor for you. But we looked specifically at their review and looking at all the studies that they selected, and they looked at them all, and we pulled all those studies and we pulled all the results from those studies. And it turns out that like 90% of their evidence didn't support their conclusion. So again, they were just, I don't know how to say it. They were untrue in what they concluded from the evidence. The evidence said no effect, or in the case of say stroke, saturated fats consistently shows a positive effect in terms of reducing stroke. So that was just I don't really even know how that happens. I suppose it happens because nobody is scrutinizing their work. Our group is really the only group that has ever existed in the 60 years that we've had, 40 years that we've had government guidelines. Our group is the only group really to scrutinize their work. So
why is it that nutrition is so, I remember reading that you had described when you first started doing this research, it was as if you were researching the mob. People just utter silence and fear. So I don't know, I kind of feel like nutrition sort of seems to be kind of a sleepy corner of the medical industry. So how did it become so cutthroat, and how does it have such a control over everything? Is it just that there is so much money in snacks and food that
so that's a really good question. There's it is not a sleepy little corner of I think in most doctors' minds it's sort of the thing you have to tell patients before you give them the pills, right? So in that way, it's not important because the advice that they give, 99 times out of 100 doesn't work. So they're right to distrust nutrition, right? But nutrition is just, it's a massive industry. So there's all the food companies, the behemoth food companies, I'm talking, Unilever and Nestle and these gigantic companies and Kraft. And it's just, I don't know the actual dollar number of the industry. And that's kind of that's the obvious interests, the financial interests in this field. But then there are other interests that I think people don't realize. And it took me a while to kind of understand it. First of all, the pharmaceutical companies, which are probably more powerful than the food companies even, they are deeply invested in all aspects of nutrition, because what is their goal? I mean, their goal is unfortunately, their goal is to either provide nutrition like supplements, like those Ensure shakes that you get with, I don't know, 50 grams of sugar in them at the hospital. But they're also invested in all the devices and all the procedures and everything that happens when you're sick and all the drugs. So they have the perverse incentive of wanting a sick, of having a sick population. For them, somebody who gets off of $1,000 of insulin a month is not good for their bottom line. So you can't sort of be cynical enough about what the pharmaceutical companies actually desire of the American population. And the average American is on 4 to 5 medications per month, and that's sort of seems like probably a sweet spot for them. They heavily donate and give up to 25-30% of the budgets of the American Diabetes Association and the American Heart Association. So now you have sort of supposedly public interest organizations that are working not in our interest. But there are even other interests that are even more obscure and bizarre. Like, there's the animal rights activists who are extremely powerful. They're very well funded. They're very passionate. And they do not want anybody eating any kind of animal foods. So they are very involved. They're the creators of movies and all kinds of propaganda that come out that people have probably seen. But they're also very much involved in this dietary guidelines process. I mean, I saw those groups. They're right in there, giving comments. They're trusted advisors in these processes. So they are extremely powerful. They're quoted. There's a group called the Physicians Responsible for Responsible Medicine, or some PCM. Yeah. It's their acronym.
I've looked at them.
They are quoted in, they're basically an animal rights group that masquerades as with white coats on as being doctors. And some of them are doctors, but many of them are not. And their main goal, if you look through their, and I've looked through much of their filings and documents, is about animal rights. They're quoted by the New York Times and the Washington Post. So, so they're a major factor. And then there's the, even more bizarre, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which is a church devoted to its one of its top missions is to get people involved in healthcare and in food and nutrition specifically. And they have as a doctrine this belief that people should not eat animal foods. And they do outreach. Their outreach involves, say, cooking classes or finding ways to interact with people to teach them about veganism, basically, as a way of kind of connecting with them and bringing them into. It's one of their ways they reach out to people and bring them into the church. So, and they're very powerful. I mean, one of the members, they have their own university called Loma Linda University. And they have other universities as well, but a Loma Linda University professor was one of the people on the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, the expert group in charge of reviewing the science for this most recent guideline. So, I mean, that's as high up as you could possibly get in the world of nutrition. So, and then we won't even, we could go on. I don't know. There's the hundreds of millions invested in all the fake food companies, the lab grown meats, the Beyond Burger, the Impossible Burger, this whole booming new field of foods that are fake foods. In general, the grocery industry is not it's not a booming field. It's not like, it's not considered like a great investment in terms of its returns. But now these kind of ersatz foods have insane valuations. And there's not a food they're not trying to replace, replace egg white, just everything, eggs, cheese, meat. So, and I think with the kind of the energy of climate change behind it, it's become the darling of celebrities and the world economic elite. And that is all of that is just a confluence of forces that are really, really powerful.
That sounds so dire. Like, do we have a shot? Like, do I have like 10 more years of eating carnivore and then there's like no meat left?
I don't know what the outcome will be. It seems that there just has to be a correction in this overreach. Like they've just reached so far. And I think, so it's hard to imagine, especially, I mean, my greatest hope really is that the power that people feel when they get healthy is just undeniable. And if see your formerly, obese friend all of a sudden look great, and feel great, that is so persuasive, right? I think so. I think that the power of this movement is hard to stop because people learn from their peers and they can't deceive their own eyes and they can't be deceived by their own bodies. I also think that the rate at which veganism has been adopted is going to come back and bite itself in, and maybe I'm wrong in saying this, but I think that as people really become vegan and become ill, people's children, 12-year-old girls, 13-year-old boys, all going vegan. And there's, I'm not on these message boards, but I'm just told that they're full of people who are recovering, really trying to regain their health after having fallen quite sick on those diets, or women not able to have children. I think there may be some kind of retrenchment from an idea that, once so many people are involved, these stories are no longer obscure. I mean, they become more, I think they'll become more mainstream, but
Yeah.
um,
Well, can we shift to talking a little bit about, Black health in the Black community?
yeah.
And, so when I talk to some of the other, low carb physicians and carnivore physicians who, basically kind of say, the more that we can do to stay out of the medical system, the better, because, our needs are not, they're not central, they're not, we in some cases may get good care, but in other cases may get terrible care, and it's better to just do your best to stay out of it. So when I and certainly when I look at studies that, they're of course not done on people of color, so we don't really know necessarily how we might respond to some of these medications or therapies. So I don't know if you can speak to that at all.
Well, yes. I mean, one thing I think that is common to Black and white people is staying out of the medical system is probably trying to stay away from having to visit a lot of doctors is a good thing, just in the sense that, doctors are trained to prescribe pills or something. They feel like a successful office visit is to give you something on a prescription. That's how they see a successful office visit. So I think anybody I would hope that anybody who goes to a doctor who understands that they want to approach their problems primarily through good nutrition, and finding a doctor along those lines is right for people of any color. There is a lot that's been said about the so-called social determinants of health, and how the health of Black and brown people is consistently worse because due to all kinds of determinants of health. And this is the way the public health community is talking about this issue. My problem with this, and I think part of it is real. I mean, if it's hard for you, if you live in a place where you feel it's dangerous and you can't get out to exercise, or you have a doctor who doesn't know, say, that that Black people have a different vitamin D response, or that women present differently in terms of their have heart attacks with different indicators. Like you can have heart disease as a Black woman and have high HDL, which is not something that you would see in white women as much. So But the problem with trying to describe everything in terms of these other determinants of health, these social determinants of health, is that they barely acknowledge that nutrition is at all part of this. So, like they, originally when I tried to submit a paper saying like, I think we need a paper on how nutrition is a determinant of health. And that sort of the public health community is really closed to that idea. Like they just want to, they'll talk about the environment, they'll talk about racism, they'll talk about a lot of other things, but they won't talk about nutrition, which I think is kind of an oversight. I don't think I'm directly answering your question about what do you do about going to the doctor's office, because I just don't know that much.
Well, I don't know that there's an answer to that. It's just,
It's like, it's really, I mean, a real eye opener for me was I took on a project where I looked at all the nutrition studies that had been reviewed, like every single study that had been reviewed for the dietary guidelines that came out last year. And we found that 90% of them, more than 90% of them were conducted on, or the subjects of those studies were white people, they did not take into consideration race and ethnicity at all. And in most of those populations, they were kind of middle class or upper middle class. So it was kind of a shock to realize, because the language of the government has always been like, oh, well, we want to be inclusive, we want to be responsive, we want to include people from different backgrounds and ethnicities and cultures. But then you look at the studies, the actual studies that they're using, it's all white people. So that to me was really an eye-opener and disturbing. It's like, it's not that there aren't studies that include also Black people, but for some reason, they're just, I mean, I don't know where that research is being done, but I think it's really problematic that there's not, we have this all binding national policy that doesn't even give an inch to, people who are not, mainstream white people. And even in that community, people are different. I mean, so I don't know if there's like a great answer to your question that I can really give. I mean, I think, I can tell you that, I think that the best solution for anybody is to try to find a doctor who really understands what kind of mission that they are on with their health.
Mm-hmm.
And then,
which is not easy to do.
Which is really hard.
Not easy to
That's
do.
hard enough.
But actually, what you just said about Black women not presenting with heart disease in the way that white women do, I mean, having high HDL, and maybe there are other things. Like, I didn't even know about that. So.
Well, I just learned that from my doctor friend. So I'm hoping that I'm conveying correct information, but she was absolutely sure of this. And she really is, one of her core issues is she wants to work on, equity in healthcare, that there be, really, it's absurd that doctors are not taught these differences. I mean, and just to like give you kind of a layered understanding of this, all the cholesterol, they tell you your cholesterol is supposed to be between this range and that range, and all of that is determined on data for men. And when the data for women, I mean, this may no longer be true, but when this started coming out in the 80s, when the data for women looked different, they just disregarded the data on women. So this was, again, from that Framingham study. It started to show that actually women over 50 with high cholesterol lived longer. But like, what doctor do you go to when you say, my cholesterol is pretty high? We'll say like, hey, good for you. Like, no, nobody says that. It's because they over and over again, they opted for really simplistic messages because they didn't want to confuse the public. And that meant just relying on data on white men. Mm-hmm. Now there may be more nuance today. I don't know. I don't necessarily haven't studied it every point along the way, but that kind of simplification has really been problematic. And that's why, again, like seeing a practitioner with some awareness is really important.
Well, I have heard, I remember reading a book that was published maybe 10 or 15 years ago about low carb that made a similar assertion that that, you know, like looking at that ratio of HDL to LDL and triglycerides may not work in the Black community because Black people don't necessarily have the high triglycerides that another, you know,
That's it.
sicker person has. Right. And
Correct.
then I could never find a single other person who said anything about it, couldn't find any studies and couldn't find anything. So I was just kind of like, but I don't know, maybe that is true. And then I've heard other
Right. Yeah.
doctors say things like they think Black people have a greater, just a greater negative response to sugar. And so things like, you know, diabetes, the outcomes are worse in, you know, the Black community. There's, you know, way more amputations and way more blindness and all of that. And people ending up on dialysis. And so the outcomes are just worse, even in the same time frame, and where things are similar between the families in terms of, you know, economics and whatnot. So
Well,
we
that,
don't know why.
I mean, that desperately needs research and study too. I mean, that is just incredibly important that we know the answers to those questions. And you're right about the triglycerides. That was another part of what I was told. But you know, we have to hunt this down and figure out we have to get a citation for this so that we know that we're telling people the right thing. But I think, yeah, I mean, this is all really. I know one of the explanations that that came to mind to me was that, and this may not be true, you just cited a study you said where even when people were economically matched, but it is true that poor Black and brown, just poor people in general, rely a lot more on government food, right? They're the people who start from the very beginning with those, you know, those food baskets, and then their kids maybe are on government food for breakfast and for lunch, and then maybe they're part of the SNAP program. And so what you're getting is a diet that is all vegetable oils and over 50% is carbohydrates. So, you know, if you're talking about people who are poor, they're definitely being sent down that path of sickness based on the government foods they're being given.
Mm-hmm.
So that may not be the community that you're talking about from your study, but I think that's also a possibility. And that I mean, we should correct for that anyway, but
well, the diabetes one I was thinking of was, I think it was a ProPublica article that was looking at health outcomes for Black people in Mississippi with diabetes. So I'm going to assume that it probably was also low income, but
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's a really excellent research topic that somebody should. I'm sure the research is, some of it is out there. It's just worth digging up and really trying to understand all of that better.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I try every now and then to kind of look through journal articles and whatnot, but well, one, they're so expensive, and half part of me is like, I should enroll in school or something, so at least I can get, you know, like I can get access to this stuff. And you know, some of it's free, and you know, but it can be hard to find what you're looking for and then to really understand what you're reading. I mean, I feel like I don't know that, or maybe whatever basic science I got in high school, like telling me how to evaluate, you know, data that I'm being presented, you know, is a challenge, because I feel like what you're saying, you can't just read the intro and the conclusion and believe that you're walking away with good information. I now trust no one, which is difficult, especially in the climate that we're in. It's, you know, there's so little trust, and I think it's warranted that there is little trust for, you know, the people who are supposed to be authorities in science.
We're having a trust war. I mean, you know, it's sort of like the short version of it is, people are skeptical for good reason, but you can't always trust the skeptics. I mean, that's sort of, there's just, I think that right now the government and sort of the kind of the medical establishment is so desperate to get everybody vaccinated and so much wants to take measures that they think are good for ending the coronavirus, that they have there's just sort of an extra layer of demonization of anybody who questions or is a skeptic of any kind. And the answer to that is, you're right. Sometimes skeptics are wrong, and sometimes there are people who are spreading misinformation, but there are just as many cases where the skeptics are the ones who have made important breakthroughs. So there's no rule that tells you one is right or the other is wrong, but it is, it's a war of words is what it is at the moment.
Yeah. And I find that, unfortunately, my friends and people that I know casually are, they kind of have so taken on this information, are so ready to have a fight. And then they get upset with me when I don't engage with them in the same way, because I'm like, you're spouting a bunch of rhetoric and buzzwords, and I'm asking you for, data. Like, why do you think this? Like, where are you getting this? And if you can't engage in a conversation like that, I don't really want to talk with you, because it's just a waste of time. Like, I can throw out buzzwords,
Right.
I can throw you something out that I read in Elle magazine or whatever. But,
right. Yeah. Well, I think it's really hard I mean, as you were saying, like, it's hard even if you go and you get a scientific paper yourself and try to understand it and know what it says and try to understand the type of science, and then to try to understand the really confusing ways in which they use statistics. And I mean, I find it hard. And then to try to understand it kind of in the totality of the field. I mean, that is why it takes so much time to try to get to the bottom of something. Like, that is why it took me so long to write my book. Or it's really it's really difficult to get to the bottom of things. And the stories that we all of us read and see in newspapers and magazines, I mean, I would say, 90 times out of 100, they're not meaningful headlines, or they're headlines that are rely on like super weak data. And one of the things that I try when people say, like, what's the most important thing I can do for my health? I say, like, never trust a headline that says something is associated with something else, or is linked to something else, or, blueberries may be linked to eye disease or whatever. It's like, if anything's linked to something else, it's just one of those associational studies. Could be right, could be wrong, more likely wrong. And so and then the problem is that, even our top newspapers, all our magazines, everything is full of them, and they just mix up all different kinds of data, and they just they stick something with a finding that kind of works in their little briefly done story. And it's, to some extent, it's not their fault, because they're writing on deadline and they have to worry about being clickbait. And, but it is kind of their fault, because they're trying, they're the ones that people are following their advice. I don't know how many people are old enough to remember the oat bran thing, but we were all eating oat bran for like a year and a half before we realized, actually it doesn't protect against heart disease, and it makes me constipated. So it's like,
so this is the first time I've learned this information. I mean, I gave up on it because it just didn't make me feel well, but I didn't know that it was then shown that it didn't.
No, it doesn't.
But see, it's like, even when this stuff gets corrected, it doesn't trickle down to people. Like,
that's right.
Yeah.
Right. The corrections don't. Right. They don't. It's the headline, the first time headline, that really gets the attention, and corrections are never noticed. But that's why this kind of fight that we're having, these diet wars that we're having, I mean, we're way outspent. I mean, when I say we, I'm saying the side that, believes in low carb or carnivore or keto, or, I mean, we're way outspent in sort of the information world. We don't have the websites and the newspapers and this and that, but we are, if you go on social media, which may, soon maybe that'll be censored too, but if you go on social media and you see the response to an article or something, you really see, like, there are more people who are talking the truth than, or at least what I would consider to be the truth, or what I think the evidence shows, than there are people who are saying, hey, yeah, that nuts and seeds and whole grain diet really, really reverse my diabetes for me, because it doesn't.
Yeah, I hear a lot of people say things like that it does that, but I'm like, well, where are these people? Like, I see people who are still struggling. Their blood sugars are still not under control. They're still overweight. They still have a lot of inflammation. And that's what I see when I see people trying to follow their doctor's diet. And I even had, I don't know what doctors say, but like periodically like reach back out to people that I've chatted with on social media. And I chatted with somebody, I was like, how's your keto going? And she's like, oh, I had to give it up. I got sick. And I was like, oh, that sucks. Did you get, what happened or whatever? And she said, well, I was diagnosed with diabetes. And I was like, why would you give up keto? Right. But I don't know what the doctors told her, but she was just like, no, I gotta, handle this.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's ironic. I mean, also, like, if you're really doing keto, how did you get diabetes?
Well, I think, this concept of the frankenfoods and the snacks and, how keto has been sort of co-opted by, now this food and snack industry, I think it's hard to do keto. When I first started keto in 2015, like there weren't any of these products. So like if you were keto, that meant that, you ate vegetables and meat and, and so there wasn't really a lot of other stuff. But now I feel like I might still be eating 100 grams of carbs a day and think that I'm doing keto because I've bought keto this and keto that. And,
right. Yeah. Right. I haven't really seen that whole world. I mean, I guess people buy things online. It's still really hard to find anything in a supermarket, or I don't see it in the supermarkets. But you're right. And
there's stuff with the word keto on it. I don't know what it, actually
no, it never is keto. I mean, if you flip it over, there's nothing, it doesn't look anything like keto.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah. Well, there's, industry follows. I mean, this whole world, when you started in 2015 and my book came out around then, like this world was just like this little growing band of people and everybody knew each other. And it was really sort of a humble, modest place. And now there's a lot of big business in it. And I guess that's to be expected, right? Well, that's why there are voices like yours who are out there letting people know how to do it right.
Yeah. That's what I try to do, and to do it in a way that's not, I feel like there's a lot of clickbait everywhere, and fear mongering. So, I want people to come in and think that this is something that they can try, like they can figure out how to work it into their lifestyle, and it doesn't have to be painful, difficult, it can be a pleasure.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be like nothing to do with perfection, and it's just real food.
Yeah. Well, I will say, like, and sort of paradoxically, in defense of real keto bars, like there's Susie's Good Fat bars, or I don't know, she rebranded them to Love Good. Oh, that's what they are. So let me see. So Susie's, the Love Good Fat bars, which are genuinely keto. I think there is a place for foods like that. And the reasons are simple. Like some people they just need something that tastes like that fills that craving. And it's not going to be fixed by whipped cream or they just need to have fix that craving. And it's better doing that with a keto bar than a whatever other kind of chocolate bar. And the other reason that I think those foods are important or necessary is for kids' lunches. I mean, there is no kid, I don't know what kid wants to take out their lettuce wrapped little pork things. I mean, it's just like, it's really hard for kids. They want to fit in and they need to have foods that look like a granola bar. It looks like a granola bar, but but it's a keto bar.
Mm-hmm. I don't know. I must have been the only weird kid because I love beef so much and never felt like I got enough of it. And when I went to college, for 2 months straight, all I ate was cheeseburgers. Now, admittedly, it was on a bun and there was ketchup, but that was what I ate every day at the, cafeteria, until I finally kind of felt like, oh, okay, I've gotten all the beef.
That was better than me. The only protein that I would eat was cottage cheese, and otherwise I ate bagels. And yeah, I was a lot less healthy than you were. I thought meat was just like the enemy.
Yeah.
So
you have given me so much information. I feel like when I was kind of thinking about how to go about having this conversation and making sure that we touched on everything, and there was so much to touch on and so much more we haven't touched on, but I feel like I've kept you forever. So I really appreciate your giving me all of this time. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. It's really been a pleasure to watch your show and now to be on it. So I hope we'll do another one soon.
Absolutely. I would love that. And and so where can people find you, or how can they help? Like, do you need volunteer support? Like, how do we support your efforts?
Well, that's really nice of you to ask. So the Nutrition Coalition is just nutritioncoalition.us, and you can definitely write an email. I mean, the main things to do are to sign up for our mailing list, and if you have the means, to donate, because we are really the only organization, we're the only watchdog group that is keeping an eye on these dietary guidelines.
Are you like a political action committee or a lobbyist, or?
No, we're a nonprofit educational organization. So we do have a sister organization that doesn't have a nonprofit status that could take more action, but that is not my group. So yeah, I mean, donate or write us an email, sign up for our newsletter. All of those things are good and support us. And my own personal website is ninateichholz.com, which you can put in your show notes, so I don't have to spell it for people. And I'm most active on Twitter at Big Fat Surprise.
Okay. And can we write letters to our Congress members? Like, how, or is it too late, or when is the next cycle of like activity going on?
Yeah, that's a good question. So not yet, because the dietary guidelines have not started up yet. That process hasn't started. So what we've been doing this year is basically writing a bunch of academic papers that kind of provide all the evidence of everything that's gone wrong with the guidelines, like my story that I told you about, how 90% of the studies did not support their saturated fat recommendation. Well, so we've been working on papers that really analyze and get into the peer-reviewed literature these important facts about the guidelines. And then we won't have a ramp up of participation probably until next year.
Mm-hmm.
So that's when people can start getting involved again. Okay. But I will tell you that it is really hard. There are keto members of Congress. There are 4 or 5 keto members of Congress, but there's a reluctance to take on our issue because donors to members of Congress are, first of all, every member of Congress gets donations from the pharmaceutical industry, every single one of them. And then, they often have food company donors. And there's a lot of, it's just really hard to get past those interests.
Right.
The head of the whole diabetes caucus in Congress, who cares about especially type 1 diabetes, except he's from a wheat state. So if you start talking about a low carb diet, you can just see like the eyes glaze over, like, nope, we're not going that direction.
But he probably is keto. It just doesn't tell anybody.
Maybe.
Have you ever seen him eat a donut? No.
I'm gonna try that next time. Look, I brought all these donuts for you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, anyway, thank you so much. I really do appreciate it. This conversation has been awesome. And I look forward to next time having, continuing the conversation and getting lots more questions answered. And everybody who is watching, please go to the Nutrition Coalition, sign up on the newsletter, and look for ways, to get involved, to get engaged, to support. And hopefully, we'll see more in the next couple of years of things that we can do. But, this is an incredibly important issue and it's not going away. So we need you to be involved.
Thank you. Very well said. second all of that. And thank you again for having me on your show. It's really a
Sure,
pleasure.
absolutely.